Consider the flickering flame of a candle or oil lamp. This small circle of light bounded the world of readers and scribes in libraries across the Roman Empire thousands of years ago. When the sun set, the grand columned halls were plunged into darkness, and the shelves laden with papyrus scrolls disappeared into the shadows. But for some, night didn't mean ceasing work. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a time when the mind could truly be alone with books, away from the noisy chaos of the day. In ancient Rome, the library was more than just a place to store books. At that time, the library was the embodiment of intellectual identity, social status, and civic virtue. For a Roman citizen, owning a private library meant not only access to books, it meant proclaiming one's education, taste, and philosophical depth. Public libraries, on the other hand, were symbols of an intellectual link between emperors and wealthy philanthropists and the public. This study comprehensively examines the library environment in the ancient Roman world, the practical and cultural dimensions of night work, lighting methods, the living conditions of scribes and readers, the special relationship between the Roman intellectual tradition and night, and the traces of this history on modern thought. This text, approximately 15,000 words long, aims to bring to life one of the most magical scenes of the ancient world, the figure of a Roman scholar opening a scroll by the lamplight. Chapter 1: The Historical Development of Roman Libraries. The birth of the first libraries and the Hellenistic legacy. The Roman library tradition did not arise spontaneously and out of nowhere. Its roots extend to the Hellenistic world, especially to the legendary Great Library in Alexandria. Founded in the early 3rd century BC under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Library of Alexandria was the greatest intellectual project of antiquity. This enormous institution, which reportedly housed nearly 500,000 papyrus scrolls, attracted scholars from all over the Mediterranean world. Rome came into contact with Greek culture not through war, but largely through intellectual admiration. Roman commanders brought Greek libraries with them from conquered lands, and at the same time, they fell in love with the values these libraries represented. When Aemilius Paulus defeated King Perseus of Macedonia in 168 BC, valuable books were among the spoils captured. These books were transported to Rome and formed the core of its own library tradition. When Sulla captured Athens in 86 BC, he brought with him the Apollinicon, a private library containing the works of Aristotle and Theophrastus. This was not merely an act of plunder, it was also a dramatic moment in the transfer of the Greek philosophical heritage to Roman lands. According to an old account, these books contained notes in Aristotle's own handwriting and were studied with great interest by a linguist named Trajan in Rome. The period of Caesar and Augustus, the establishment of public libraries. Julius Caesar planned to gift the Roman people with a great public library. He entrusted this project to Marcus Terentius Varro, a leading intellectual of the time. Varro was one of Rome's greatest scholars. He had written hundreds of works on Latin and Greek languages, agriculture, philosophy, and theology. The library that would take shape under his guidance would bring together both Greek and Latin literature under one roof. However, Caesar's assassination left this project unfinished. When Augustus became emperor, he brought his father-in-law's unfinished dream to life. In 39 BC, Gaius Asinius Pollio, a close friend and patron of artists under Augustus's guidance, established perhaps the first true public library in Rome. Known as the Atrium Libertatis, or Courtyard of Liberty, this structure was built in the center of Rome and housed both Greek and Latin works. Then Augustus himself intervened. The Bibliotheca Apollinis, which he established adjacent to the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, best reflected the emperor's vision of a library. This library, with its marble columns, precious sculptures, and meticulously placed lighting, it proved that a library in Rome could also be a work of architecture and art. The library in Porticus Octaviae was built in memory of Octavia, Augustus' sister, and functioned as a sister institution complementing the Palatine Library. The proliferation of libraries during the imperial period. Subsequent emperors made the construction of libraries almost a tradition. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, or Vespasian, opened new libraries in the city. His sons Titus and Domitian continued this legacy. However, the greatest step in the history of Roman libraries was taken during the reign of Emperor Trajan. The Library of Ulpia, opened in 112 AD, was part of the Forum of Trajan. Organized into two separate halls, one for Greek works, the other for Latin works, this structure represented the pinnacle of Roman library architecture. In the center of the halls rose Trajan's monumental column, visible from both halls. It symbolized the intertwining of knowledge with a triumphal procession. During the reign of Hadrian, library construction extended beyond the imperial borders. The library that Hadrian gifted to Athens still partially stands today. This gesture has gone down in history as one of the strongest expressions of Rome's respect for Greek culture. Alongside all these institutional developments, private libraries also held great importance in the intellectual life of Roman society. From Cicero's villa in Tusculum to Pliny the Younger's mansion in Bithynia, wealthy Romans established personal libraries, which became venues for intellectual gatherings, philosophical discussions, and literary readings. Chapter 2: Physical Space and Architecture. Structure and Design of Library Buildings. Roman libraries were built with a unique architectural approach. The fundamental characteristic of these structures was to provide the necessary climatic conditions for the preservation of books. Papyrus was an extremely sensitive material to moisture. Excessive moisture led to its disintegration, while drought caused it to crack. Therefore, library architects generally positioned the buildings to best receive sunlight but be protected from direct rain and humidity. Vitruvius, in his comprehensive work on architecture in 10 books, offers advice on library construction. According to him, library halls should be oriented to the east to receive the morning sun. This offered two practical advantages. First, the morning light provided the most comfortable natural lighting for readers. Second, the intense sun during midday and afternoon prevented overheating, which could lead to moisture buildup and book decay. The interior layout of library halls was remarkably standardized. Wooden or stone shelves, known in Latin as armaria, lined the walls and held papyrus scrolls or leather-bound books. These shelves were usually positioned about a meter back from the wall. The space between the wall and the shelf allowed for air circulation and acted as a buffer against the building's humidity. In the center or at the edges of the halls were areas reserved for readers. These were sometimes simple wooden platforms, sometimes marble benches. In grand libraries, niches adorned with busts of philosophers and writers formed a spatial framework for a spiritual dialogue with intellectual ancestors. The Library of Ulpia, as a model. Located in the very center of the Forum of Trajan, the Library of Ulpia is considered the best preserved example of Roman library architecture. Archaeological excavations and the testimonies of ancient writers allow us to obtain quite detailed information about this structure. The library followed a rectangular plan consisting of two separate halls. Each hall was approximately 20 meters by 20 meters in size. Two-story corridors ran along the perimeter of the halls. In these corridors, armaria were placed in niches carved into the walls. The shelves on the upper floor were positioned slightly further back than those on the lower floor and were accessible via a narrow wooden passageway. The base of the structure was raised above ground level for thermal insulation. This practice, in addition to preventing moisture from coming from the ground, created a buffer between the cold floor, which could harbor moisture, and the air in the hall. Large windows were designed to maximize daylight flowing from the ceiling. However, how these windows affected nighttime use highlighted the issue of lighting. Private libraries, the transformation of the villa space. In addition to the opulent architecture of public libraries, private libraries played an equally decisive role in the intellectual life of Roman society. For a wealthy Roman, dedicating a separate library room in their villa or city house was not a privilege, but almost a mandatory rule of etiquette. Cicero's letters contain pages of descriptions of his library organization. In a letter to Atticus, he details how he arranged his Greek books, how he labeled his armarius, and how he hired an expert to catalog his books. Cicero's library was not merely a storehouse of books, it was also the center of his intellectual and literary output. Pliny the Younger, in his letters describing his villas, pays particular attention to the library rooms. When describing his villa in Laurentinum, he notes that the library room was filled with sunlight at certain times, and that it had different qualities of light in the mornings and afternoons. He writes that he did this. This observation reveals how consciously and deliberately the people of antiquity used natural light. Chapter 3: Lighting Technology and Night Work. Artificial lighting sources in ancient Rome. In the ancient world, artificial light was both valuable and limited. The darkness that began with the setting of the sun created a real obstacle to work. Two basic tools were used to overcome this obstacle: oil lamps and candles. Oil lamps were the most common lighting tools in the ancient world. These lamps, called lucerna, were usually made of clay or bronze. Olive oil or animal fat, which was poured into them, served as fuel. A thin wick was dipped in the oil and lit. The resulting flame was small but stable. A single lucerna produced enough light to make reading possible within a radius of about 40 centimeters. In more affluent households and public spaces, multi-wick or multi-eyed lamps were used. These were combined to create a more powerful light source. The various lamp types found in the excavations of Pompeii clearly demonstrate Roman creativity in this regard. In luxurious versions, tall lamp stands called candelabras were used, on which multiple lamps were placed. Candles, candela or cereus in Latin, became more widely used, especially from the 1st century AD onwards. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and left less soot compared to animal fat-based candles. However, beeswax was expensive, therefore, while it was preferred in wealthy households, candles made from animal fat or tallow were used in middle-class residences. Reading in lamplight, practical challenges. Reading in front of a flickering oil lamp or the flames of a candle was a task far more difficult than modern man can imagine. First, the light was insufficient. The brightness produced by a single oil lamp was less than 1% of that of a modern table lamp. This meant constantly straining the eyes. Second, the light was not constant. Any air current, even a gust of wind or a breath through an open door, would make the flame flicker, the shadows dance, and instantly make reading the text difficult. Therefore, readers working at night would either bring the book closer to the lamp's level or place the lamp as close as possible. Thirdly, oil lamps and candles produced soot and smoke. Keeping multiple lamps burning for hours in a closed room polluted the air. Therefore, windows were kept open during night work, but this also brought up the problem of cold and wind. In his work Epigrams, Martialis occasionally touches upon these difficulties of night work with a witty tone. He mocks an unsuccessful poet, saying, "Your book burns even in the darkest corners of the night," an ironic reference to the book being both worthless enough to burn and close enough to the fire to serve as a light source. Arrangements to facilitate night work. In situations where night work was unavoidable, the Romans developed a number of practical solutions. The most common method was to strategically position multiple lamps. Lamps placed around the work area minimized shadow areas and ensured even illumination of the reading surface. In some luxury villas, tall lamp stands called candelabras were used for both aesthetic and functional purposes. Multi-wick lamps placed on these stands contributed to the general lighting of the room, while a single lamp on the table provided direct reading light. This two-tiered lighting system is surprisingly similar to the modern understanding of interior lighting. Reflective surfaces were also used from time to time. Polished metal plates or silver containers could be placed at strategic points to focus the lamplight in a particular direction. This was a primitive but effective way to increase the light obtained from the lamp. Another important consideration for scribes and readers was the whiteness of the working surface. The light yellowish color of papyrus increased its capacity to reflect light. Dark-colored or old, tanned scrolls were much more difficult to read under the same lighting conditions. Chapter 4: Scribes, Readers, and Library Staff. Chapter 4: Scribes, Readers, and Library Staff. Structure of library staff. A Roman library was not merely a place where books were stored, it was also an organized and vibrant institution managed by trained personnel. At the head of this staff was the bibliothecarius, or librarian. The bibliothecarius was responsible for maintaining the catalog of the collection, acquiring new books, preserving existing works, and responding to the requests of users. Under the library director were employees in various categories. Some were free citizens, however, many were educated slaves. In Roman society, educated slaves, especially those of Greek origin, were highly valued as library staff. These individuals copied books, kept catalogs, and organized the collection. They undertook tasks such as labor. Scribes, called scribes, played a critical role in the functioning of the library. These were specialists who copied texts onto papyrus or leather in a meticulous and legible handwriting. The production of a book was often the result of hours, even days, of work by a scribe. Scriptorium, copying workshop. The scriptorium or copying workshop, directly connected to the library, was where night work was most intense. Here, scribes produced new copies by quoting from the original scroll or book in front of them. The process usually worked as follows: a skilled reader would read the original text aloud. This person was called a lector or anagnotes. The other scribes would simultaneously write down the text they were listening to. This system was both economical and efficient, as it allowed for the production of multiple copies at the same time. Night work represented a particularly challenging context for the scriptorium. In an environment where multiple people worked simultaneously, numerous lamps and candles were needed to provide adequate lighting. The use of so many light sources together heated the room, caused smoke to accumulate, and strained the eyes of the workers. Clerks working in night scriptoriums would sometimes leave short notes at the end or margin of the works they were copying, expressing their fatigue or complaints. These notes, known as colophons, are extremely valuable documents today. These notes, containing expressions such as, "My fingers are numb, my eyes are burning, but the scroll is finished," directly convey the physical reality of night work. Readers' library use practices. A reader in a Roman library had a very different experience than a modern library visitor. First of all, books, papyrus scrolls or leather-bound codices, were not borrowed. The reader had to read the book inside the library or under an adjacent porch. Except for some exceptions and special permissions, it was forbidden to take books out. The procedure a reader followed when needing a particular work was as follows: they would tell the bibliothecarius or their assistant which work they were looking for, and the bibliothecarius would search the collection's ledger, tabula or index, and determine where the work was located on the shelf. Then an assistant would find that shelf and retrieve the requested manuscript. Library use at night presented a different picture for private and public institutions. In private libraries, it was possible to work at night with the permission of the owner and the provision of a lamp. Public libraries, on the other hand, closed their doors at sunset. Security and protection of the library were the biggest constraints on working at night. Chapter 5: The Night Work Tradition of Roman Intellectuals. Lucubratio, working by lamplight at night. There was a special word in Latin for working at night, lucubratio. This concept derives from the word root lux, light, and means, to work by lamplight. The very existence of the word is meaningful, for the vocabulary of a language reflects the priorities and concerns of its speakers in their daily lives. The fact that the Romans coined a special term for working at night proves how ingrained this practice was in Roman intellectual life. Cicero frequently uses the word lucubratio. He himself was a writer renowned for working late into the night. In his letters and works, he recounts composing philosophical works, preparing speeches, and writing long letters to friends in the dim light of a lamp. For Cicero, night represented the time when thought was truly free. These quiet hours, free from the political noise and pressure of social demands of the day, were the times when the deepest philosophical thought flourished. Pliny the Younger, nephew of Pliny the Great, paints the most striking portrait of the lucubratio tradition in his famous letters describing his uncle's work habits. Pliny the Great recounts that he would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to begin his writing and reading sessions, listen to reading groups before and after meals, and even request readings aloud during bathing and exercise. This illustrates how night work was perceived as a virtue. Night work in the Stoic and Epicurean tradition. Among Roman intellectuals, night work was not only a practical necessity but also symbolized a philosophical virtue. Stoicism considered discipline and self-control as the foundation of virtue. To forego physical comfort and work the mind in the early morning or late at night was, from this philosophical perspective, a virtuous act. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, one of the greatest representatives of Roman Stoicism, repeatedly discusses night work in his letters to his friend Lucilius. In this collection called Epistulae Moralis, Seneca describes how the silence of the night allows the mind to work so deeply. Only when the social obligations, noise, and distractions of the world are left behind can a person truly confront himself and the laws of the universe. Epictetus Discourses advises students to rise early in the morning and begin philosophical study in the early hours. This advice points to a different dimension of night study, the meeting point of night and morning, that is, the twilight hours, represents the most productive time, both physically and mentally. Marcus Aurelius and night thought. Perhaps the most striking memory of night study in Roman history belongs to Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This work, known as Meditations, or Thoughts, consists of personal notes that the emperor wrote during campaigns, in war tents, at night by the light of a campfire or lamp. These notes were not written for public. There is no evidence that Marcus Aurelius intended to publish them. They are records of a person's reckoning with himself, of his attempt to apply the principles of Stoic philosophy to his own life in the silence of morning or night. The brevity of the sentences, their sometimes incomplete or seemingly disorganized structure, suggests that these texts were written spontaneously, perhaps as the last few lines before the nightlight was switched off. Marcus Aurelius writes, "Tell yourself this in the morning: today I will encounter curious, pretentious, ungrateful, unreliable, jealous, and antisocial people." In these lines, we can sense how the mental preparation before the start of the day was shaped in the early morning or late the previous night. Chapter 6: The Night Atmosphere of the Library. Silence, smell, and feeling, a sensory recreation. Trying to recreate the night atmosphere of an ancient Roman library requires a historical exercise in imagination. Because this atmosphere is fundamentally different from the modern experience. Not in sound, but consider something similar. After the sun sets, the noise of the main streets has subsided, the chirping of the forum and the basilica has ceased. At this hour, a visitor approaching the library building could feel the cold surface of the marble columns in the night air. Upon entering, the first thing felt would not be warmth, but a heavy scent, the awe-inspiring aroma of salt and herbs from ancient papyrus, the slight sharpness of olive oil, and beneath all this, the characteristic smell of dust and time itself. Although the public library is closed for the night, let us transport our imagination to a moment of permitted study, or to the night scenes of a private library. A few oil lamps cast their flickering light in the hall. Shadows conceal the bookshelves, and only the spines of the scrolls in the immediate vicinity are visible. The labels, Latin or Greek titles, are now barely legible. The seeker either relies on the location of the shelf they have memorized or finds the correct scroll by recognizing the handwriting upon closer inspection. The burning lamps crackle softly, the wick occasionally chokes with burnt oil, and as the flames slightly diminish, the darkness deepens a moment. The worker adjusts the wick or pours in fresh oil. These short breaks are like a moment of respite within the rhythm of night work. The social dimension of night work. Night work was never a completely solitary activity in the Roman world. In wealthy households, at least one slave or free servant was present while the master worked at night. This person's duties included checking the lamp, bringing new oil or candles if needed, waking the master if he fell asleep, and reading texts or taking notes if necessary. This social arrangement is extremely important in illuminating the class structure and the institution of slavery in the ancient world. A Roman intellectual's night work inevitably came at the expense of disturbing the sleep of others. This asymmetry was something the Romans themselves were aware of. Writers like Seneca and Pliny recount that they sometimes felt uncomfortable burdening their servants or slaves with such heavy responsibilities. On the other hand, in intellectual circles, night work sometimes became a shared activity. Philosophers or writers would gather in a house library, read together, discuss together, and think together. These gatherings, symposium or convivium, would begin during the day and extend into the night. With alcohol, food, and conversation all present, the library environment transformed into a natural setting for philosophical discussion. Nighttime dangers and fear in the library. In the ancient world, night held a very different meaning than in the modern world. Street lighting was absent or extremely limited. Darkness symbolized a physical threat to security, both in terms of robbery and supernatural dangers. Roman streets were officially considered dangerous at night. Juvenalis, in his work Satire, advises a Roman citizen to spend the night at home because going out at night could mean being attacked. This reality made the nighttime environment of the library unique. This requires us to consider it in light of one thing: accessing the library at night or staying in the library until late at night meant a significant security risk. In addition, people in the ancient world were extremely sensitive to the supernatural dimensions of the night. Ghosts, manes or lemurs, were believed to appear at night. A library full of ancient books, where ancestral works were kept, evoked both respect and fear. Some ancient texts mention beliefs that evil spirits were imprisoned in certain books or that they contained dangerous information. Chapter 7: Librarianship and Book Culture. From papyrus to codex, the transformation of book form. In ancient Rome, the physical form of the book directly influenced how night work was carried out. In the first centuries, the papyrus scroll, or volumen, was the dominant book format. A volumen consisted of a strip of papyrus wrapped around wooden or ivory sticks. The reader would unfold and rewind the scroll as they progressed through the text. Therefore, in ancient Greek, the act of reading a book was expressed by a verb that literally meant to open. The papyrus scroll had an advantage for nighttime use. Its small size made it easier to hold with a lamplight. However, the constant opening and closing of the scroll required the hands and fingers to be constantly engaged. This could be tiring during long night sessions. From the 1st century AD onwards, the codex format, a book consisting of pages stitched together, became increasingly common. Codexes written on leather or parchment were initially used primarily for private notes and drafts. However, over time they became the format in which full texts were written. The codex had a great advantage for nighttime work. It was possible to keep a specific page open, leaving both hands free. Writing tools and materials. In a library or scriptorium, a carefully selected set of tools and materials would be available to the person working at night. The pen used for writing on papyrus was known in Latin as the calamus. This was a pen made from the sharpened end of a reed. It was dipped in ink and pressed onto the surface to create writing. The ink, atramentum, was usually made by mixing soot or burnt charcoal with gum. This mixture was diluted with water and kept in a container. During night work, it was important to keep the lid of the ink container closed. An ink container left open all night could dry out and lead to unnecessary loss. The wax tablet, tabula serrata, was an indispensable part of night work. Temporary notes were taken on the surface of wax poured into a wooden frame, using a stylus. When the notes were no longer useful, the surface was smoothed with the reverse end of the stylus or a heated spatula, making it reusable. This was the recyclable notebook of the ancient world. Organization of library collections. For night work to be efficient, it was essential that the library collection be well organized. To find what he was looking for in a dark or semi-dark environment, the reader needed to know the collection's layout perfectly or have a reliable guide. In Roman libraries, collections were mainly divided into two major categories: Greek works and Latin works. In large libraries, these two categories were physically housed in separate halls. Inside, the works were grouped according to their subjects: poetry, history, philosophy, medicine, law, agriculture, etc. A titulus, meaning label, was affixed to the outside of each scroll or codex. This label included the author's name, the title of the work, and sometimes the volume number. Catalogues called indexes were kept for the management of large collections. However, it remains unclear to what extent these catalogues were detailed and whether they were easily accessible during night work. Chapter 8: Night Work of Private Librarians. Cicero's Library and Night Routine. Marcus Tullius Cicero is one of the most prolific and versatile writers in Roman history. Cicero, a man who combined orator, statesman, lawyer, and philosopher in one, has left us with unique insights into both his late-night work habits and the library culture of his time. In his letters to Atticus, Cicero provides extremely detailed information about his libraries. He had built large private libraries in his villas in Tusculum and Cumae, meticulously organizing them and furnishing them with the most valuable works. Atticus's library, in turn, was one of the most comprehensive private collections of the time, and Cicero occasionally borrowed books from Atticus or had copies made. Cicero's late-night work routine can be traced through clues in his letters. He notes that his work often extended into the late hours, particularly during periods when he was under political pressure or writing major works, such as philosophical works like De Republica, De Finibus, and Academica. In some letters, he recounts how his eyes closed from exhaustion but he continued writing. In other letters, he describes waking up at night to jot down an idea or argument that suddenly came to him. Pliny the Great, the tireless night worker. Gaius Pliny the Secundus, also known as Pliny the Great, is perhaps one of the most prolific writers of the ancient world. As he himself states in his encyclopedic work, Naturalis Historia, this work was created by examining 2,000 books and the works of more than 40 authors. The secret of this enormous productivity was largely based on working at night. Pliny the Lesser, in his famous letter describing his uncle's work habits, recounts, Pliny the Great never stopped working, even during politically dangerous times, such as the reign of Nero. He would wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock, begin to write, and work until sunrise. Then a short sleep, then work again. Although he relaxed somewhat during the Flavian dynasty, this routine remained essentially unchanged. Pliny the Great's method of work was based on reading aloud and taking notes. Pliny the Great would take notes or dictate while his reader, anagnotes, read the text to him. This method increased his capacity to read and write simultaneously tenfold. Reading sessions were not interrupted even during baths, meals, or even while traveling in a carriage. This picture reveals that night work was not only an individual effort but also an organized group activity. To make Pliny the Great's night work possible, at least one anagnotes and probably 1 or 2 scribes had to stay awake at night. Varro's encyclopedic undertaking. Marcus Terentius Varro is the most prolific writer in Roman history. According to some sources, he wrote more than 600 books. Varro's productivity cannot be explained without night work. Writing in many fields such as history, philosophy, linguistics, agriculture, and geography, Varro continued to work uninterrupted, especially in the last period of his life, even in his 80s. Varro's agricultural work, Rerum Rusticarum, is written in dialogue form, and its preface contains clues about how he spent his days as an old man. Varro emphasizes, above all, the importance of valuing time. A person can only produce when the body is healthy and the mind is fresh, therefore, every moment must be valued. This statement reflects an attitude that also naturalizes working at night. Chapter 9: institutions and rules governing the library. Administrative structure in imperial libraries. Public Roman libraries were supervised by various branches of the imperial administration. The imperial libraries established during the Augustan period initially operated directly under the supervision of the emperor or a procurator appointed by him. Over time, this administrative function was transferred to imperial bureaucrats such as the epistulis or a bibliothecis, who acted as a kind of senior supervisor. Daily administration was the responsibility of the bibliothecarius. This person, the bibliothecarius, was responsible for the preservation of the collection, new acquisitions, the operation of the copying workshop, and visitor management. In large institutions, assistant librarians and numerous trained slaves worked under the bibliothecarius. The library's opening hours were most likely from a few hours before sunrise, that is, before sunset. Library staff were responsible for collecting books, arranging shelves, and ensuring the security of the building. At night, the doors were locked and guards were on watch. Night access, permissions and exceptions. So, was it possible to work at night in a public library? The answer to this question is most likely yes, but only with special permission and privilege. Imperial libraries were managed within an established hierarchy. A person approved by the emperor or the palace could request permission for night access under certain conditions. How was such a request made? Probably through the bibliothecarius or by applying directly to the imperial palace. If permitted, individuals were expected to bring a trusted companion and their own lighting. The library was not obligated to provide its own lamps for the night, nor had it adopted this as a policy. In private libraries, the situation was more flexible. With the permission and supervision of the host, invited guests or trusted friends could work in the library until late at night. In some cases, the host himself would also participate in these night sessions, and the work environment would transform into a philosophical conversation. Security and protection of books. The most important factor shaping the night policy of Roman libraries was undoubtedly the security of the books. Papyrus and parchment were extremely fire-sensitive materials. In an environment where numerous lamps or candles were lit, the risk of fire was a real and serious danger. A single lamp accidentally knocked over could lead to the destruction of centuries-old works. This concern is reflected in the tragedies that history presents us with. It is becoming a reality. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is perhaps the greatest intellectual tragedy of the ancient world. However, ancient sources contradict each other regarding how the fire started, who started it, or whether it was completely destroyed. In Rome, book collections also suffered great damage during various fires. The lighting of fires in libraries at night should therefore be considered both a practical risk and an institutional concern. The sensitivity in protecting large collections was one of the strongest justifications for restricting access at night. Chapter 10: The Legacy of the Hellenistic Tradition in Rome. The Library of Alexandria and the Idealization of Knowledge. Any discussion of Roman libraries cannot be considered independently of the Library of Alexandria. Founded by Ptolemy I Soter in the 3rd century BC and developed by his successors, this enormous institution captured the intellectual imagination of the ancient world so powerfully that it almost became a legend. The Library of Alexandria was designed not only to store books but also for active research and teaching. The Museion, also known as the Temple of Museums, was a complex where scholars literally lived and worked, complete with dormitories, dining halls, and promenades. Teachers working in fields such as poetry, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were drawn here with state support. This model had a profound impact on Roman librarianship. While Roman libraries did not fully embrace Alexandria's ideal of being a true center of intellectual life, the idea that the library was not merely a storage space but also a place for intellectual gathering and discussion was strongly entrenched. The Pergamon Library and its relationship with Rome. Besides Alexandria, the library in Pergamon was considered the second largest intellectual center of the ancient world. Legend has it that the Pergamon Library housed approximately 200,000 volumes. More importantly, its existence is directly linked to the widespread use of parchment, membrana or carta pergamena in Latin. Legend says that when Alexandria banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon, the Pergamonians developed parchment as an alternative. While this story is historically questionable, the rivalry between the two great libraries is considered to be real. And when this rivalry reached Rome, it didn't just become a competition over the number of books or the size of the buildings, it also brought with it methodological debates about how books should be written, stored, and made accessible. The Romans adopted both Hellenistic traditions and adapted them to their own needs. Especially during the Augustan period, Roman librarianship absorbed both Alexandria's ideal of comprehensiveness and Pergamon's practical tools, including the use of parchment. A night in 1st century AD Rome. When we put all the historical information together, we can form a realistic mental image of what a night work scene might have looked like in ancient Rome. This exercise helps us remember that history is not merely a collection of facts, it is also a series of lived experiences. Mid-1st century AD. One of Rome's most populous periods. With a population exceeding 1 million, it was the largest city in the ancient world. It is now approaching midnight. The shops and tabernas around the forum have long since closed. Dog howling can be heard in the distance, harsh sounds from the back streets of Subura, followed by a profound silence. In a medium-sized urban house, a domus, with walls painted blue and red on the slopes of the Aventinus Hill, the master Quintus Hortensius Philologus continues his work. As his name suggests, he is of Greek origin, or at least deeply fascinated by Greek culture. He is in his late 30s, a law student, but his real passion is philosophy and history. In the middle of his study, 12 scrolls and several leather-bound codexes are scattered on the table. To his left, a 3-wick oil lamp burns in a rectangular bronze basin. In the right corner of the room, a young slave, 18 years old, fluent in Greek, sits beside a small chest, occasionally leaning forward to try and stay awake. His name is Sojas. Quintus holds the scroll in front of him with his right hand, slowly unfolding it with his left. On the slightly yellowish surface of the papyrus is Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. Quintus is searching for a specific paragraph. He plans to build an argument based on the ancient example in his legal defense tomorrow. He opens the 3rd scroll to search, but the section he is looking for is not there. Sojas, he calls softly. The young man is startled. Take the 5th scroll, from the right side of the shelf. Thucydides, Book 3. Sojas gets up, takes the lamp, and goes to the shelf. Thucydides, Book 3. Sojas gets up, takes the lamp, and goes to the shelf. He brings the lamp closer to read the labels on the shelf. The shadows shift. For a moment, the room is almost completely shrouded in darkness. The rhythm and emotional texture of night work. In this imaginary but historically possible scene, we can sense that night work is not merely an intellectual activity. We also see that it is a physical investment, a matter of patience and endurance, an asymmetrical but real relationship between two people. Quintus finds the scroll and finds the paragraph he wants. With a small stylus, he makes short notes on the wax tablet. The wax is lightly traced under the pressure of the pen, a clay-like feel, smooth lines that gleam slightly in the light. Sometimes, after taking a note, he pauses, raises his head, and looks at the ceiling of the room. He thinks. Perhaps this is the greatest gift of night work, silence and uninterruptedness. The knocking at the door during the day, the visitors, the constant coming and going of the servants, the sounds rising from the street, all of this ceases at midnight. Only the flickering sound of the lamp, the slight rustling as the papyrus turns, and the sound of the argument forming in the mind remain. In his short work De Somno, Aristotle discusses the state between sleep and wakefulness. Some Roman thinkers adopted this idea, arguing that the hours between late night and early morning are the time when the mind is clearest and sharpest. The fatigue of the day has been left behind, but the body's need for sleep has not yet fully prevailed. In this intermediate period, thought can gain extraordinary clarity. Chapter 12: Women and the Library. Women readers in Rome. When considering Roman library culture, it is necessary not to overlook the place of women within this culture and the issue of night work. Contrary to popular perception, women in Rome were not entirely deprived of reading and writing. Women, especially those from the wealthy classes, received a strong education and occasionally participated in intellectual life. Cicero's daughter, Tullia, discussed philosophical topics with her father through letters. The interest of Augustus' sister Octavia and his daughter Julia in poetry and literature is well known. The poet Sulpicia is one of the few female voices in ancient Rome who wrote poetry under their own name. These women's reading practices and access to libraries were likely shaped on a private level. Women's access to public libraries was probably more limited than that of men. However, whether this restriction was legal or social is debatable. On the other hand, in private libraries, that is, in their own villas or their husbands' homes, they could freely develop their reading and study habits. Female intellectuals and night work. Ancient sources do not offer direct testimonies regarding women working at night. However, indirect evidence is thought-provoking in this regard. Hortensia's famous forum speech, her powerful address against tax policy in 42 BC, is the product of an extraordinary education and preparation process. This preparation likely took place not only during the day but also at night. By the 4th to 5th centuries AD, we see that female intellectuals in late antiquity had a more distinct profile. We know that Hypatia of Alexandria, the mathematician and Neoplatonic philosopher, had both an intensive teaching and research practice. It is almost certain that this practice also included night work. To fully understand the history of Roman libraries and intellectual life, it is necessary to consider both the evidence that makes visible the place of women in this history and the social structure that limits this visibility. Chapter 13: The Social Functions of the Library. Library, Power and Status. Building a library in ancient Rome was not merely an intellectual gesture, it was also a powerful political and social message. By building libraries, emperors both emphasized the importance they placed on the education of the people and positioned themselves as patrons of culture and civilization. Augustus's library adjacent to the Temple of Apollo is extremely significant in this respect. Apollo was the god of art and wisdom. Establishing a library adjacent to his temple meant reinforcing the legitimacy of power with cultural and religious authority. Augustus presented himself not only as a political authority but also as the protector of the highest values of Roman civilization: knowledge, beauty, order. This political dimension also carries meaning in the context of working at night. For an emperor or statesman, working at night, that is, thinking about the state even while the people were asleep, was presented as a virtue demonstrating the extent of governing responsibility. Augustus's regular and disciplined work habits are praised by the historian Suetonius. The library as a space for philosophical debate. Both private and public Roman libraries also functioned as spaces for philosophical debates. The library, along with the porticos and recreation areas immediately adjacent to it, provided a ready environment for thinkers to gather. Cicero's philosophical dialogues, works such as Tusculan Disputations, De Finibus, and De Natura Deorum, were fictionalized in villas. Although these dialogues took place in courtyards or gardens, the real debates they represented were largely shaped in or around the library environment. A host's library was a natural gathering place for an exchange of ideas, because resources related to the subject of the discussion were readily accessible. In this environment, night was the hour when the deepest layers of discussion were reached. A dinner, a convivium, beginning with glasses of wine would turn into a philosophical discussion, and as the discussion progressed, so did the night. Going to the library and opening a particular work could be used to strengthen or refute the argument. Chapter 14: Losses, Destructions, and Legacy. The fate of Roman libraries. The history of Roman libraries is, unfortunately, largely a history of destruction and loss. From the 3rd century AD onwards, with the weakening of the empire, the maintenance of libraries and the renewal of their collections also faltered. Some libraries burned in fires, some collapsed due to neglect, and some were destroyed or completely annihilated during invasions. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, traditionally dated to 476 AD, many works in Latin were either completely lost or survived only in the form of corrupted copies. The greatest responsibility for preservation fell to Christian monasteries during this period. Monasteries, particularly those in Ireland and Italy, bridged the gap between ancient heritage and the Middle Ages by continuing the copying of classical works. This paradox is fascinating. Rome's pagan library tradition survived largely in the hands of Christian monks. In monastic scriptoriums, texts were transcribed page by page, scroll by scroll, with a discipline and dedication similar to that of scribes working in the great libraries of the ancient world, centuries later forming the basis of Renaissance humanism. Continuity in the East, Constantinople and the Islamic world. Simultaneously with the destruction in the West, the library tradition continued in a different form in the East. Constantinople, after its founding by Constantine the Great in 330 AD, quickly transformed into a cultural center. Constantine and his successors established important libraries that both collected and preserved the legacy of ancient literature. Byzantine librarianship transmitted the legacy of Greek and, to some extent, Latin literature for centuries. After the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in the 15th century AD, many Byzantine scholars fled to Italy with valuable manuscripts. This migration was one of the factors that triggered the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. On the other hand, the Islamic world preserved and developed a large part of ancient knowledge by translating it into Arabic between the 8th and 13th centuries AD. The Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, in Baghdad was the center of this translation and synthesis activity. The translators and scholars working there tirelessly added the knowledge of ancient Greek, Roman, Indian, and Persian to the intellectual heritage of Islamic civilization. Chapter 15, Lessons for the Modern World. Reflections of the ancient night work tradition on the present day. What lessons does the library culture and night work tradition of ancient Rome hold for the present day? This question has real meaning beyond mere nostalgic curiosity. First of all, the issue of the democratization of access to information arises. In ancient Rome, establishing and accessing a library required either imperial support or great wealth. The vast majority of society, slaves, free but poor city dwellers, peasants, were completely excluded from library life. The modern understanding of libraries, however, theoretically aims for universal access. This represents a real civilized advancement. Secondly, the health aspect of night work can be evaluated from a modern perspective. The fact that ancient Romans worked for hours under lamplight posed a serious risk to their eyesight. Modern research is increasingly understanding the effects of artificial light on biological rhythms. In this context, understanding how close ancient Romans stayed to the natural rhythm of the sun and when they deviated from this rhythm offers an interesting basis for comparison. Thirdly, the issue of information preservation remains critically important today. Digital formats face threats similar to the decay of ancient papyri, data loss, format incompatibility, cyber attacks, and institutional neglect threaten modern digital libraries. The enormous information losses experienced in ancient Rome serve as a reminder of how vital preservation policies are. Silence and depth, the relevance of an ancient value. Perhaps the most valuable lesson the ancient tradition of night work offers the modern world is the recognition of silence and depth as a value. In the digital age of constant connectivity, instant notifications, and uninterrupted information flow, the figure of the Roman scholar opening a scroll in the silence of the night offers a remarkable contrast. Seneca writes in one of his letters, "Withdraw into yourself, at least protect yourself from the lower strata of daily life. Spend time with some people. Spend it so that it may bring you good." Although this advice was written 2,000 years ago, it carries a fresh and urgent meaning today, speaking to modern man overwhelmed by the noise of social media and the constant demands of the attention economy. Night in ancient Rome was a time not only for work but also for deep thought. Opening a scroll and hearing the voice of the knowledge it contained meant speaking with the voices of thousands of years ago. This experience, reading an ancient text in a flickering light, in a silent world, satisfies man's most fundamental intellectual desire, to transcend time and reach understanding. Conclusion: the eternal return of light and mind. As we come to the end of this long journey, we can see what night work in a library in ancient Rome meant from a much richer perspective. It was not merely a physical act. The body sat on a chair or cushion, the eyes focused on the pale surface of the papyrus, the fingers touched the cold surface of the pen or stylus. But far beyond that, this act carried a profound cultural and philosophical meaning. For the Roman intellectual, night work, lucubratio, was a virtue. Postponing physical comfort and engaging the mind embodied the Stoic spirit and self-control. Contemplating the brevity of mortal life and the infinity of knowledge must have both humbled and exalted the individual. Roman libraries were not merely places where books were stored, they were also points where civilization, the Greek Hellenistic legacy, Roman legal and political genius, and philosophical inquiry converged. Those who spent their nights in these libraries, whether statesmen and writers like Cicero, tireless encyclopedists like Pliny the Great, or anonymous scribes or scriptorium workers, became part of the continuity of civilization, whether they were aware of it or not. Today, thousands of years later, the fact that we can read parts of the texts they copied or annotated that night is one of history's greatest miracles. Despite fires, invasions, neglect, and the destructive power of time, something has survived. This survival is partly thanks to those flickering lamplights, partly thanks to the determination of those who continued to write even in an environment that broke their eyes, gripped their fingers, and reeked of smoke. Even when the lamp goes out, the light of knowledge does not. This is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the ancient Roman library tradition. No matter how dark the night, the torch of the mind can continue to burn. And as long as that torch is passed from one generation to another, civilization continues to live.